In this chapter, we'll see how to implement another advanced component from the Kendo UI library, the Kendo Grid. One of our new requirements for the RPS project tracker is to make the list of backlog items pageable and sortable. The Kendo Grid can handle these features as well as over 100 other features. Because the grid is so configurable and there are so many features, I suggest having the site open while you develop so you can use it for reference. In fact, you should probably have that site open all the time during this course. In this chapter, we'll set up the grid and configure it to display our backlog items, and then we'll add paging and sorting. And finally, we'll see how to use the grid with a convenient data query package.
We're going to add the grid to our backlog page. Right now, we just have a list of backlog items that's displayed as a table. The filters up here that show either My Items, Open Items, or Done Items. Let's take a look at the documentation and we'll see how the installation should take place. And just as always, we have a simple command that uses the Angular CLI. I'm going to copy this code. Let's just take a look at the dependencies here. You can see that there are quite a few dependencies, including some Angular ones and the Kendo data query. We'll be looking at the Kendo data query a little bit later. Let's head out to the terminal, and I'm going to terminate the currently running process, and let's run this CLI command to install the Kendo Angular grid. When that finishes, let's issue the ng-serve command to kick off our server. Now that we have the grid installed, let's go ahead and add it to our backlog page. Open up Modules, Backlog, Pages, and then Backlog Page Component HTML. Right here, we're already displaying an app list, which is a component that's showing a table. And we have an items property that we're binding all the list items to asynchronously using the async pipe. All right, so let's take a look at the component that's rendering our list. Here it is. This is just an HTML table, and it has some bootstrap styling. So we have these 6 columns here. The first column has the icon, then assignee, title, priority, estimate, and then created date. And we have some special styling associated with each one of these. For the icon, we have a function that gets the indicator image based on the item. For the user avatar, we're rendering an image. For the priority column, we have this badge that we're rendering, something similar to what we've done before with dropdowns, where we're getting the priority class, just so that we have our badges look a little bit different for each of the priority types. And then we have an estimate, which is just rendered as a number. And finally, we have a date created, which is using an Angular date pipe. The result looks like this. All our items are displayed here on one page with no filtering, no sorting, and no paging. Instead of this list, we're going to go back to the backlog page component, and right up here above the list, I'm going to render the Kendo grid. And Kendo grid doesn't have an items property, but it has a data property. And just like we did here for the app list, we're going to bind the data property to the items observable and put it through the async pipe, so we're subscribing. I'm going to delete this app list down here. So all we have now is the Kendo grid. Let's also open up the code for this component, and we're going to import from Progress Kendo Angular Grid the Kendo Grid utility array. Let's also add it to our imports of the component. By the way, this is getting too long to fit on one line. On a Mac, you can hit Option Z to toggle line wrapping in Visual Studio Code. Let's take a look at what that did. Okay, the Kendo Grid automatically takes whatever properties are on each object and renders them. Sometimes it guesses on what type to display, and other times, like this tasks and assignee, it doesn't know what to do or how to display those items. This is quite a messy grid here. It is showing everything in the grid and everything in our data set, but it's hard to see and it's not what we want. We want to be able to control which columns we show and how each column renders. Right now, our grid doesn't look too good. It's displaying every single property on every single object, but we want to generate these columns in a controlled fashion, and we want to let the grid know how to render certain objects like assignee. We can control what properties the grid renders by using the Kendo Grid column. Let's go to the code, and inside the Kendo Grid element, we're going to start specifying Kendo Grid columns. There's the Kendo Grid column element, We're going to do this for every column that we want to display, and we're going to start off with a simple one. Let's do the title. So I'm going to specify the field that I want to display, and each item has a title field. This is the main field, and it could be pretty wide. I'm going to give it a width, and I'm going to specify the width to be 300. Now, because we've specified a column, the grid is going to ignore all the other properties on the objects and just match that one column, the title property. So here we go. We only have one column here, but the display of the title is inferred based on the property name. We can set the title of this column to be title capitalized. And there it is. There's the title for the column. That's a very simple one. Let's add another column that we're going to display, and that's going to be the type. So we're going to show the icon for the type of item it is. I'm going to create a Kendo grid column here. Actually, I'm just going to copy this one. The field that I want to show first is type. And I don't want to show a title here. So I'm going to leave the title as an empty string. And because I'm just showing an icon, I'm going to have it be pretty small. So a width of 40 will do. For this column, I want to display an image. Kendo Grid is not going to know how to display an image just because I have a URL in the type field. So we need to specify how we can display that column. And we do this with the ng template. To specify that this ng template is how we want to render this cell in the grid, we give it a directive called Kendo Grid Cell Template. And we specify a template variable. We're going to call it data item. Inside the template, we can render whatever HTML we want. In this case, we just want to render an image. So the source of the image is going to be provided by the getIndicatorImage function. And we're going to pass in the data item. Let's just give it a class so that our image is not huge. We're going to keep it to 20 pixels by 20 pixels by applying this backlog icon class. Let me quickly show you this backlog icon class, which is defined right here in backlog page component. That's limiting the height of the image to be displayed to 20 pixels. And this getIndicatorImage function lives in the code behind right here. Based on the item type, it's calling the image res from item type. And we've seen this function used before to display icons in our dropdowns. Now our column has type icons for every one of these items. Next, let's specify the assignee column. I'm going to paste this in right after our type column. There it is. The field we're matching is the assignee field. We're giving it the title assignee, a width. It's also going to use an ng template. This time we're going to have an image and a span. The span will display the assignee's name, and the image will display the assignee's avatar with some bootstrap styling on it. Let's check it out. There we go. Now we have the assignees listed as well. I'm going to add 3 more column definitions after our title. I'm going to paste that in right here. Notice we're picking up the pace here, and I'm pasting a few pieces of code just to save some time and avoid you watching me type out code. Feel free to pause the video if you do need to slow down, if you're following along and copying code from the video. And let's just go through it real quick. The priority is going to display a badge based on the priority, low, medium, high, and critical, and it's going to have different color badges. The estimate is just going to be a number, so we don't need to specify a template for that. And the date created is going to be a date displayed according to the Angular date pipe. Let's take a look. Now you might see a message like this that says no pipe found with name date. And that's because this pipe right here going to date is not actually imported into our component. So let's go to the code and quickly import that formatter. Right over here from Angular Common, we're going to import the date pipe. And then in our component imports, let's add that date pipe in there as well. And there's our grid. This looks pretty much just like it did before, a little bit better. It has some automatic styling applied, and it's showing all our records. The filters at the top are still working because we're asynchronously binding to our items observable. So we don't even need to touch that. Now I don't want to scroll my page all the way down here. And I want to be able to see the grid and just be able to scroll the grid and still be able to operate my filter buttons up here. So we need to limit the height of the grid somehow, and we can do that just by applying the height attribute to the Kendo grid itself. So I'm going to limit this to 410 pixels. And there it is. Now I can just scroll the grid itself and still be able to filter things and see my buttons up here. Now there's one piece of functionality that we used to have that we lost here. And that's if I tap on one of these items, I'm tapping right now, it's not navigating to our details page, which is what we want. We need to make this grid selectable. So let's go to our code and we're going to add a property here that's called selectable. We're going to data bind this to selectable settings. And selectable settings is an object that we need to create in the code. It's based on the selectable settings type that comes with the Kendo grid. And at the top, I'm going to create a new property called selectable settings. And it's going to be of the type selectable settings, which is not imported yet, but I can use Visual Studio Code Auto Import to import that right here from Kendo Angular Grid. And I'm just going to instantiate this inline. It has a few properties, checkbox only, enabled, and mode. I'm going to use checkbox only and I'm going to set that to false because we don't want to select this just by using checkboxes, which is a user interface method that can be used to select rows of a grid. Here we're just going to use the row click itself. We also need to listen for the selection change event. So let's go here to the Kendo grid and specify selection changed as an event. And I'm going to create the onSelectionChange handler. Let's pass the parameters. And I'm going to create this in the code. So let's go down here. Here is my old select list item event handler. This is the one we used with the old component, but I'm going to create a new one here called onSelectionChanged. And this takes in some args. These are of type selection event, which is also imported from Kendo Angular Grid. So the idea is that we're going to navigate to the details page and pass in the item ID, similar to the way we did here in the select list item. But first, we need to grab a hold of the item itself, so then we can get its ID. And that comes in with the args and selected rows. Because Kendo Grid allows us to select multiple rows, selected rows is an array. But we know we're only going to be able to select one row by clicking on it. So we're only going to look at the first selected row and its data item. We're going to cast that to PT item and store it in a variable called cell item. Now we can just copy this navigation line and pass in cell item.id. Let's save everything and take a look. I'm going to tap on one of these items and sure enough, we get navigated to the details page of that item. Now, displaying all the items on one page is not very convenient. One of our requirements, in fact, says that we need to have paging. So let's take care of that next. We'll add paging to our grid. We're currently binding our grid to items, which is just our own data type. And Kendo Grid figures it out just fine. However, Kendo Grid has a special abstraction for the data that you provide to the Kendo Grid if you're going to be doing a lot of data operations through the server, which is typically how you would perform paging in the first place. Kendo Grid is fully capable of paging on the client, which is what we'll be doing in this lesson, but this abstraction that we're going to use allows you to do client-side paging as well as server-side paging. So instead of providing items here, we're going to provide something else. So let's go up here to the top of our component, and I'm going to create a new property called grid data. This is going to be of the type grid data result. And you guessed it, this comes from the Kendo Angular Grid module. So grid data can be grid data result or undefined. And we want to bind the data attribute of our Kendo Grid to grid data. Now, how do we get data into this grid data and what does it look like? If I press F12 on grid data result and then look at data result, which is the parent, you'll see that we have data and we have a total. Data are going to be our items and total is going to be the total number of items that comes from the server. So if you are paging using the server side, your data array will have a few items based on the page size, let's say 10 items, and total will have the total number of items that are in the entire data set. Let's say you have 2,000 items. So our grid data has a total and data properties on it. We need to populate those. Let's go to our ng-on-init, and here we are already getting items into our items observable. Well, because it's an observable, we can subscribe to it. So this dot items subscribe, and whenever items changes, this will let us know. Here we'll get our items, which are of type PT item array, and we'll be able to build our grid data this way. So this dot grid data will be an object. Now, this is complaining because grid data has two required properties, data and total. So total is easy. That's going to be items.length. Of course, if you were getting this data directly from the server, you'd send back a similar shape with the items and total being separate properties. But here I'm just calculating the total based on the items received, which are going to be all our items. So how do we get this data array in here? Well, we need to create paging. And typically when you have paging, you have different parameters for paging. You have skip, and then you have page size. So here I'm going to create a public property called skip. I'm going to instantiate that to 0. I'm going to create another public property called page size. And I want the page size to be 10. So I want to show 10 items per page. Now for the data property, instead of an empty array, we're going to take a slice of the incoming items based on the skip and the page size. So we're going to do item slice this dot skip. That's how many we're skipping. And then this dot skip plus this dot page size are the items we're taking. We're not quite done yet. We have our grid data. Let's go back to the HTML, and we need a couple of other attributes here. The most important one to make this Kendo grid pageable is pageable. Pageable will be set to true. We need to also bind skip. We'll bind that right to skip, and page size will be bound to page size. I'm going to save everything and let's take a look. Okay, there we go. My filters are working, but notice that it doesn't work quite well when I'm hitting the pager buttons. We need to respond to the page change event in order for us to show the new items based on each page. So let's go back here to our Kendo grid, and we're going to bind the page change event to onPageChange. Let's go ahead and create this function in our code right over here. OnPageChange. This will get some args, and the type of args is page change event. And that's coming right from the Kendo Angular Grid module. There it is. Now this args has skip and take on it. This way, right before we refetch our data, we can reset our global skip to args.skip. And then we need a way to refetch the data. We already have a refresh function, and that's right over here. So we're just going to call it this dot refresh. And that'll refresh our items based on the current skip value. I'm going to save and let's take a look. Okay, so now our paging is working. Excellent. The version 2 RPS requirements state that we also want to have this grid sortable. And it's pretty simple to make the Kendo grid sortable. All we need to do is just define sorting so that when you tap on one of these headers in the grid, that particular column will end up being sorted. Let's start out making this sortable on the HTML side. And you might have already guessed how we do this. We add a sortable attribute, and we set that equal to true. But just making that true is not going to work quite the way we expect. We also need to define some sorting settings. So let's also bind a sort attribute, and we're going to define some sorting settings. We're going to call it sort. Let's go over to our code. And right up here under paging, I'm going to create a public property here called sort. And this is going to be of type sort descriptor. And this is our first interface that's going to be coming from the Kendo data query. We're going to start working with the data query in this lesson and the next one. This is going to give us an abstraction over using the grid that's going to simplify a lot of things. So we're going to start with this sort descriptor array. And let's put an object in there. We're going to say field, title, and direction ascending. This will give us the initial sorting configuration for our grid. Now also we need to take that into account when we subscribe and we set our grid data. Right now we're just taking a slice of the items that are coming back, but we're not sorting it in any way. And we need to do that in order for our sort to work. We're going to use another function called order by, and that's also coming from the Kendo data query. order by is going to take the items, and as the second parameter, it's going to take in that sort descriptor. Just make sure to import order by from Kendo data query. All right, I'm going to save this and take a look. Don't worry, this might seem a little complicated right now, but we'll drastically simplify it in the next lesson. Okay, so I've loaded this page up, and you'll notice right away there's a little arrow pointing up by title, and that's because we've set our sort descriptor to initialize at title in ascending order. And that's what's happening here. You can see that all our items are sorted by title, and they start with numbers, and then they are sorted alphabetically. If I tap on this, nothing happens, and that's because we're not binding the sort change event. We need to manually bind that as well. So let's go up to the HTML again, and we're going to bind the sort change event, and we're going to create the onSort change handler. I'm going to head out to the code, and right here under onPageChange, I'm going to create one called onSortChange. As the parameter to this function, we're going to receive the sort descriptor array. So once the sort change event has occurred, we're going to set the local sort property to the one that comes in based on what we need. All right, and then I'm going to call this.refresh again to fetch the data. And this is going to be useful in case you're doing some kind of server-side sorting as well. So I'm going to save everything and let's take a look. I'm going to tap on title, and now you see that our items are sorted in reverse order. If I tap on priority, you'll see that our priorities are sorted now. Estimate, now we're sorted by estimate. What happens if I tap on assignee? It's doing some kind of sorting, but it doesn't seem to be working quite right. Well, that's because assignee is actually an object. So our sorting function doesn't know what property to look at when it tries to compare the names here. Well, that's easy to fix. Let's head out to our sort change function. And right over here, we're going to check to see by what property we're trying to sort. So in the incoming sort descriptor, we're going to look at the first item, and we're going to look at the field. And if it equals assignee, then we're actually going to reset it, because we don't want to look at assignee, which is an object. We actually want to set it to assignee.fullname, because we want to compare the names of the assignees and not the assignees themselves. Let's save this and take a look. Okay, now when I tap on assignee, you can see that our names are sorted by assignee. Let's take a look at a simpler way of configuring the sorting and the paging and filtering, and we're going to use the data query for that in the next lesson. Kendo Grid provides us all these individual functions and bindings for sorting, paging, pageable, sortable, but it's a little bit tedious sometimes to work with those. However, the Telerik team created a separate module called Data Query that has commonly used data tasks. We've already used one of these, order by, in our grid in our previous lesson, but we can utilize even more of data query functions and interfaces to make working with the grid even easier. Data query comes with something called state. It's named very generically, I know, but we can use that here. So let's go to our code, and we're going to remove skip and page size and sort. I'm just going to go ahead and remove these from here. Instead, what I want to create here is a state, and I'm going to call it grid state. This is going to be of type state, and that's coming from progress Kendo data query. I'm going to go ahead and initialize this right in line here. So if I press Control Space, you'll see what properties are available here. And I'm going to go ahead and define skip. I'm going to set that to 0. Take is like our page size. I'm going to set that to 10. Sort is going to be the sort descriptors. So that's going to be an array. And I'm going to add one more here called group. Now, there's going to be a few complaints here from the code, and we are going to need to fix up the HTML as well. Let's go here and start with our subscription and the creation of the grid data. I'm going to remove this object here, and since I'm using common interfaces that are common to the data query, I'm going to use another data query function called process. And what we want to set into that is the items and then the grid state. So this will automatically apply the grid state along with all the sorting and the filtering and the grouping. It'll apply it to the items with the process function and set grid data to that. You don't have to do anything manually here, and that's beautiful. Make sure that the process you have here is the one that's coming from Kendo data query right here. When you're using state this way, you're going to have a complementary function that's going to handle state changes. So let's create that now. We're going to call this handler on data state change. And this is going to take a new state of the type state, and we're going to set grid state to the new state, and then we're going to call refresh. Okay, we have a couple of other complaints here. Let's fix that up real quick. On page change and on sort change are complaining. We've removed skip and we've removed sort. In fact, we're not going to be using these two functions at all now. So I'm going to go ahead and comment these out, and that takes care of that. Let's go to the HTML. Here we have a couple of handlers that we no longer need, and that's the ones we just commented out in the code. Sort change, let's delete that one, and page change, let's take that one out too. But do you remember that one that we added, on data state change? We need to bind that one now. So let's bind an event called data state change, and we're going to bind it to on data state change handler. And we'll send in the parameter, which is going to be the new state. You may notice that we're binding skip and we're binding page size, but we no longer have those in our component. We do, however, have the grid state. So let's bind grid state.skip for skip, and we'll bind grid state.take for the page size. And there's one more, that's this sort one, grid state.sort. I'm going to save everything and let's take a look. Our paging is working and our sorting is working. Excellent. Why do we bother doing all this and changing over to grid state when the previous method was working? Well, besides the benefit that I've already described, which is to abstract away the data functionality from the grid UI, now it's going to be very easy to add other functions to your grid. Let's say you want to have groups. All you would need to do is come here to the HTML and say groupable equals true. And you can also bind group to grid state.group. Now, when I go to the grid, I can see another row show up here that says drag a column header and drop it here. Let's drag priority and drop it right there. And now our grid is groupable. Here's one with different priorities shown. We have a critical group and we have a high group. You want to make this grid filterable? No problem. All you need to do is add filterable and set that to true, and then bind the filter attribute to grid state.filter. And now every one of these columns has a filter. You can switch the filter to these kinds of string operations, let's say contains, and you can filter the items that way. Now, notice some of these columns don't really need to be filterable, like the icons one, for example. Well, you can turn that off. Well, you can go to the type column, and for that one column, you can say filterable, and you can set that to false. And now our type column doesn't have a filter because it doesn't make sense. What about the date here? Well, let's go take a look at the date. And I've already applied a filter by date. So this will give us a date interface to filter by. If we take a look, the filter has a little calendar icon, and I can set the 19th of January and filter by is after or equal to. The context of this filter has date operations on it. So I can say is after the 19th of January, and all these dates that are going to show up are going to be after the 19th of January. So that's the benefit of using data query with the Kendo grid.